Hey everybody, it's Jay Calderon with 12rounder.com, here to give you 12-rounder radio, and slightly bit different in terms of the formatting and stuff like that. I hope you guys enjoy it. It's nice, it's quick, there's a few thoughts in there. You can give me your take on all the thoughts, of course, and I want to hear from you in the comments section below and on Twitter at 12RounderBoxing. Just to refresh all of your memories, this past weekend we saw a bit of action, of course. We saw Tony Bellew in Liverpool take care of Nathan Cleverly down the stretch, picking up a win. We also saw George Groves and James DeGale, as well as Anthony Joshua, who I'll be talking a little bit about him later, pick up wins on that same card. And on this side of the pond, shall we say, although actually it really wasn't in any way, shape, or form, it was in Macau, China, Manny Pacquiao took care of the previously unbeaten Chris Algieri, knocking him down 6 total times, about 3 or 4 of those legitimate knockdowns, but nonetheless, point well taken, and picking up a wide unanimous decision. As a matter of fact, that entire card was, with the exception of the opening bout, in terms of the pay-per-view broadcast, all of the decisions were incredibly wide, filled with a lot of knockdowns, point deductions, and things like that, in favor of the eventual winners, those other winners being Vasily Lomachenko and Zhou Shiming. I'm not even going to attempt to butcher the names of the two guys that they beat down. In any event, it was a pretty good weekend of action, if you will, and you can check all of these results out in the link below in the description. But let's get to the stories here. First and foremost, the first thing I have on the list, just going down the list here, is what should Anthony Joshua do? The reason I asked this question is because I was talking boxing with a friend of mine, and we were trying to figure out, if we were in control of Anthony Joshua's career, what would we have him do? You know, he's obviously a very exciting guy. He certainly can punch. He has a bit of speed. He's got a good look to him. He has marketability there. He's a well-spoken guy. He seems like a well-grounded person, and he certainly has a good team over there in Matchroom Boxing that seem to be obviously very keen on taking care of him as they move him forward. Those are all the positives in terms of building up someone like Joshua. The negatives, I suppose, or the difficulties that one might encounter would be these particular things. Number one, he's in a division where it's difficult to know how good a guy is until you find out how bad he is. Meaning, there's not a lot of what I would call mid-division guys at heavyweight. Either you know exactly who a person is for the most part, and you know he's not all that good, or you know that he's Vladimir Klitschko. That's pretty much how it goes. You could maybe have a guy like Bermane Stiverne who's sort of creeping up there. I have a feeling that a guy like Stiverne might have a shot against pretty much anyone that he faces. Wilder will be an interesting fight just because he can punch. Anytime someone can punch, I know he's faced quite a few cans in his day, but anytime you have a guy who can punch, there's always that level of, let's see. But if Stiverne is able to get past Wilder, I would say he's a fairly legitimate, good, solid, top-level guy. Might not be able to beat Vladimir Klitschko. I mean, that's a different order altogether. But I wouldn't go so far as to call him even a mid guy, and I certainly wouldn't call him a lower-ranked guy. Then you have, of course, those mid-range guys that are missing in this division, and then you have the lower-ranked guys. At heavyweight, those would be guys like Tony Thompson. If you're not great, he'll find you out. If you're... Then you have guys like, who's a good example more recent times? Maybe someone like a Ruslan Chagayev. He's someone there, but he can be had by most young heavyweights at this point. That's probably just the truth of the matter. He has some semblance of a title, whatever the case may be, but it's really inconsequential. It doesn't really matter. You have guys like Robert Helenius, who seems like he at one time had maybe something going, but at this point, it's really difficult to see him making much noise just because he's not really doing much of anything at this point. He could, for the record, these people can change where they are in the division, but at this point, that's the way it feels, that's the way it looks right now. In the heavyweight division, you have guys that are in that mid-range. The problem is it's such a jump from each range. Like if you're going from the low to the mid or the mid to the high, it's almost as though you could damn near forego that middle range and just go right up to the top. Why wouldn't you? Someone like Deontay Wilder, like I said, taking on Stiverne makes sense. What's the harm in it? he has just as much chance winning that fight as he does, say, a fight against someone like Tony Thompson, who, if there's something to find out about a fighter, Thompson, at least, that sort of fighter, could find it out about you. And you're not going to get as much money as you would fighting Stavern. So why not just go for Stavern? It's not as though it's a difficult order to try and find someone at heavyweight that seems like he's the goods, that you can then move up the way you're supposed to move up fighters. There isn't a lot of those fights left. So you hear a lot of people saying, oh, well, they're trying to fight Joshua and Price next summer. It might be too soon, though, for Joshua. It's like, first of all, Price hasn't done all that much more than Joshua. I know that sounds insane, but with the exception of the Thompson fights, what has he really done? That's significantly more. He hasn't done anything. In those fights, for the record, he lost them. And what is Joshua to do if he doesn't take that sort of step? He's supposed to be fighting Kevin Johnson, a very good fight for him at this point in his career, in his next contest, and then going into the Price fight. You look at that and you think, I don't know if that necessarily... Maybe they're moving him too fast. That would be 12 fights in, and he's fighting a guy who can definitely punch, has a bit of speed himself, certainly has his flaws, but it is a very close, competitive, weirdly interesting fight. But what else could he do in this sort of division where there's just not a lot of those mid-range guys? At the end of the day, Price is probably in that mid-range, near the top of it. So in order to find out where Joshua is, that's probably the guy he has to fight. Anyone else that he fights outside of those guys is just clearly low-level stuff. And with the way Joshua has been performing as of late, and he's fighting very low-level guys, but he seems a bit above that low level. So he's in that mid-level at this point. Even he's calling it phase 2. But that does sort of mean he has to find out how good he is in comparison to the rest of those mid-level guys. And maybe he could fight Johnson, maybe he could fight another Kevin Johnson type in the summer, and then maybe push that Price fight to the end of 2015 or the beginning of 2016. But all that will have been done is waste time. We're going to have to find these things out about him. At the end of the day, they'll have a comparable number of fights, believe it or not. And if Joshua could sneak in one more sort of tune-up fight, just sort of maybe get used to the height or the reach of Price, because the height and reach of Price will be imposing, at least coming back at Joshua. Maybe something like that can make sense. But for the most part, this is kind of really all you can do. He's too talented to let him linger around these lower-level guys, but you do need to know how talented he is. And this is pretty much the only way to go about doing that. Speaking of talent, let's move on to the second subject here. Zhu Shiming and Vasily Lomachenko. What? You saw them on the same card in Macau on the Manny Pacquiao-Chris Algieri undercard, and you look at them and you think, what? There's something different there. They have gold medals. They've represented their country very well. They almost have this sort of mythical quality to how good they were when it comes to their amateur performances. They both had a lot of amateur fights. They're both a bit advanced in age, with, of course, Shiming being a bit older, but nonetheless, they have similar stories in that respect. Obviously, virtually no one parallels Lomachenko when it comes to his amateur credentials, but nonetheless, Shiming is certainly no slouch in that department. But there is a noticeable difference in their transition to the pro games. I mean, you look at Lomachenko, yes, he lost to Orlando Salido in his second fight. Maybe it was too soon. Maybe against a guy who far outweighed him, who had far more fights, and who was willing to break every single rule in the book. Maybe, no matter how many fights anyone had, that on that night, if that was going to happen, that was going to happen. The referee did nothing to stop it. He wasn't really all that penalized, other than losing his title and getting to move up after a win. Salido really didn't have to pay for any of his own sins in that fight. I don't blame Lomachenko for that fight. I think now he'd handle that fight much differently, even under the same circumstances, and would probably win. I think that fight taught him how to win that fight. And I think he's certainly a smart enough fighter to figure that out. I think he figured it out by the end of that fight and almost had Salido out of there. But I digress. The point is, you notice there's a difference between the level of the quality at which they operate when it comes to when it comes to professional boxing. The difference, I think, and again, very young in both of their careers, but the difference, they don't have 10 fights combined as pros. Unless you want to count, of course, that World Boxing Series boxing thing that Lomachenko was in, but the point is, they have very few fights in the pro games. I think the difference, however, between the two is, I think Lomachenko and Shiming both have two things in common. They both have natural abilities, and they have abilities that they had to be taught. The difference, I believe, is that one relies more on one and one relies more on the other. I think Lomachenko is a very methodical guy, but I also think he just has exceptional instincts when it comes to, and a lot of this is muscle memory and just practice and repetition, but I think he has incredible instinct when it comes to how he should handle each and every situation, each and every move in that ring at any given time. Whereas I think Shiming has to, when he's doing what he was taught, he's performing very well. It becomes sort of an issue when he's relying more on his instinct later on in a fight when he gets a bit more tired, not used to these longer fights, where you start to notice that it can unravel a bit more. He'll take a few more punches. He's naturally seems like a very game, tough guy, but it is one of those situations where when he's forced to rely on his instinct, he doesn't perform as well. When he relies more on the technical side of things, like he did early in that fight this weekend, he looks sensational. Whereas Lomachenko, I think, just naturally knows more of what he has to do. Now, he obviously has athleticism, and he certainly has been taught very well. But a lot of the things he does aren't necessarily things that you teach a fighter to do. I remember during that fight this weekend with Lomachenko, he did about 3 or 4 left hooks in a row from up close at a strange angle. You don't see that happen in preparation for fights. Like, that's not what they work on during a training camp necessarily. Maybe in sparring, but again, that's more of a natural thing. It's not a technical thing there. That's not something you're taught. Yet he did it, got away with it, wasn't in any danger when he did it, and made it look not only like the right thing to do, but made it look effortless. It's just what he was able to do. And I think that's the difference between them. I think the thing that Lomachenko, hopefully for his sake, learned in the Salido fight is he can't rely on his natural instincts, because he might be just too clean and not a rugged enough fighter in some fights. Against Salido, he has to do things that are more technical to make him pay for it, and also have that sort of taking it personal approach to it. He has to get just as mean. He has to let it out a little bit more. And I think the thing for Shiming to do, of course, is obviously work on his stamina, certainly has to work on his defense a bit more, but at the same time he has to focus on being more technical and not just letting the fight be sort of an emotional affair the entire way through. So they both have certain things they have to work on. They obviously have certain similarities and differences, but it was just sort of interesting to watch as it sort of unfolded in front of you on the same night in the same card. In any event, moving on to a different card that's going to be coming up in December. It'll be Timothy Bradley taking on Diego Chavez. And this is going to be a very brief thing. I just felt like putting it out there. But someone told me, I wouldn't be totally surprised if Chavez pulled off the upset. Now, it would be an upset, certainly. And he's a talented enough fighter that it's not completely out of the question that he wins. But I had to tell the person, let's not forget that Timothy Bradley, while he had 2 poor performances against Manny Pacquiao, and while he made the Ruslan Provodnikov fight even harder than it was already going to be, let's make no mistake about it. Yes, it had something to do with his attitude, but Provodnikov also had something to do with that fight being the way it was. The fact of the matter is, Timothy Bradley is a very good fighter, who made Juan Manuel Marquez, for example, look quite ordinary, who did have moments against Pacquiao, particularly in the first fight. In the second fight, when Pacquiao seemed a bit sharper, a bit more focused, it was pretty much all Pacquiao. But he did have some moments against Pacquiao. He's the same guy who beat Luis Abregu when he was undefeated, and prior to people realizing that Abregu was, most of the time, a little bit better. Of course, Saddam Ali might have something to say about that as well. But the point is, he is a guy who has beaten people consistently in his career. Junior Witter when he wasn't expected to. Devin Alexander when he, I believe, was a bit of an underdog in certain people's minds. This is a guy who can fight. And I know people have this tendency, just human nature, whatever the case may be, they have this tendency to want to blame the guy who inherits the decision other people had something to do with. Bradley didn't make himself the winner in that fight, nor maybe he should have done more to do so in the ring during the action, but he did nothing to to determine whether or not he was going to get those scores in the end, because they really didn't reflect the fight. That was the decision of officials. So let's not let the fact that he was the beneficiary of a poor decision influence our concept of how good of a fighter Bradley is. He's a very good fighter. And Chavez can bang a little bit. He's a tough guy and he can take a good punch. I'm not going to rule him out of winning. But to suggest that it's some sort of pick'em fight is to sell Bradley short. Bradley should win this fight. Chavez can win this fight, but Bradley should. One of the main reasons that Bradley is such a good fighter as well is his mental toughness. And that's always something that you have to focus on in fights. But it leads me to my next topic of conversation, which, of course, is Chris Algieri and the Chris Algieri show and his terrible, annoying, stupid corner during the Manny Pacquiao fight. Throughout the build-up to this fight, you heard a lot of things about mental toughness, being prepared, boxing, having a perfect plan, all these sort of things that sound good on the surface, things that you're supposed to say. But most of the time, while you hear, just like football, any other sport, you hear, we got to take it one day at a time, one game at a time, one play at a time, whatever stupid thing that they keep telling reporters. The fact of the matter is, deep down, there's a lot more. There are many more layers to this plan, because there's an actual plan. There are actual things that need to take place. When it comes to Chris Algieri and his team, it almost seems as though they just kept mentally telling themselves the sound bites that you give reporters, and that was their actual game plan. As if that was the only thing they prepped with. Just that, no, we're gonna extend the fight, we're gonna box well, and then we're gonna knock him out. Just saying things, not necessarily planning to do them, not planning how you might get these things done, just saying you're going to do them. Just telling reporters what they want to hear. I mean, the microcosm of that in that fight with Manny Pacquiao and Chris Algieri was in the round where Algieri was really genuinely dropped for the first time by most people's estimations, where it was nearly exactly at the same moment that Max Kellerman of HBO was interviewing the corner of Chris Algieri, and they were talking about how in the next round Algieri was going to be let out of his cage and was going to go for the knockout of Manny Pacquiao when he has virtually a handful of knockouts to his credit in about 20 fights. I don't know how I'm at a loss for words with how stupid that was. I don't know if they could have intended to say something in a dumber fashion, and to look dumber while doing it, considering what soon thereafter happened. But honestly, that cannot have been their plan. Because you cannot plan for, relatively speaking, light-fisted Chris Algieri to land nothing really hurtful on Pacquiao the entire fight, to not really make Pacquiao show his age by working and missing a lot of punches, to then just suddenly get let out of his cage in the 10th round and knock out Manny Pacquiao, who, career-wise, has had a decent enough chin. I don't understand this notion. It's not as though even that they were going for a lot of right hands from a countering position a la Juan Manuel Marquez. They were going with lead rights, but Pacquiao's good enough to have seen them coming, and they weren't hard enough to make him pay for not seeing them come. I don't understand what the hell they're talking about. You hear all this stuff about positive thinking, and you hear all this stuff about, willing it into fruition and envisioning it, and you have your vision board, and all these silly sort of things that seem to encompass the Algieri camp. And I just remember thinking, all that sounds good, and maybe it puts you in a good mood and it gets you through training camp. But you know what's going to get you through a fight? A training camp that you don't just get through. It's a training camp that you have to fight your way through, that you have to plan, that you have to strategize, that you have to put together to give yourself the very best chance of actually winning the biggest fight of your career. And I'm sorry, crossing your fingers and knocking on wood isn't going to do it against Manny Pacquiao. This sort of idea of hoping for the best just doesn't cut it. It was a really poor performance on the part of Team Algieri. And I'm not discrediting Algieri. Again, he showed tremendous heart. He did have some moments. He was landing some shots. It wasn't as though he was completely outclassed, but it wasn't as though he was made to look a complete fool or anything. He's a fighter. At the end of the day, you got to respect that. But honestly, if he had just worked out and gotten shape and didn't plan anything at all, I don't think that fight would have unfolded any differently. I think it would have been the exact same result, because for all intents and purposes, from what it sounds like, that's pretty much what happened anyway. Now, speaking about what's happening this weekend, we got a couple of interesting fights. One of them involves Terence Crawford. He'll be taking on Ray Beltran, defending his version of the lightweight title. He's pretty much the guy at lightweight at this moment. Undefeated, American, humble, likable guy, exciting guy. When he has a real live opponent in front of him, like he did with Ricky Burns, like he did with Yuriorkis Gamboa, like he will probably have with Ray Beltran. It's one of those interesting fights, though, that I don't know, unless Crawford moves up, I don't really know what he could do at lightweight anymore, because he is the guy. I don't, maybe you match him against Mikey Garcia if he moves up. Maybe you chase a fight with, I don't know. Some international fighter. I'm struggling to think of a name, because the fact of the matter is I don't know who I'd pick against Crawford at this point. And it's a very interesting moment in his career where he has to look very strong against Beltran in a weird way, because I want to feel like I have every reason to have all the confidence in the world that when he inevitably moves up, he's too tall, too rangy a fighter to stay at 135 forever, that he's going to impress all of us just as much, because to me he's been sensational in his last 2 or 3 fights. And I want to see him do well, because I think this is the sort of guy that can make things very interesting down the line. It's just unfortunate in a certain sense that the divisions at which he will ply his trade aren't necessarily completely it's not as though it's just a plethora of talent. He pretty much is the talent, undeniably so, at lightweight, in the sense that he'd pretty much be picked over everyone at this point. And moving up to junior welterweight, there are different sorts of options. Maybe Algieri, maybe Provodnikov, maybe Pacquiao under the right circumstances. While all of these are sort of interesting fights, I don't know if he, with maybe the exception of the Algieri fight, maybe the Provodnikov fight, I don't know if either team is necessarily super gung-ho about that fight within, say, 2015. But it's one of those situations where he's going to have to keep impressing against good enough opponents that his name stays relevant, but at the same time, while he still continues to move forward and progress. Because that's sort of the way boxing is now. It's not just about winning. It's not just about looking good. It has to seem like it's always going up. Anytime it's just a good fight, it's not good enough. So I was very happy that he won the Burns fight, in the sense that, once it was done, it was done. Who you root for, as long as you don't hate the guy that wins, who cares, Who wins is who wins. Now, what can come of it? And what came of it was a very good and interesting fight on paper, and a very good and interesting fight in the ring between him, that being Crawford, and Yuriorkis Gamboa. Now it's about trying to continue that momentum. So it'll be interesting to see what he does against Beltran, how soon thereafter he moves up, and then what the plan of attack in terms of going into that division becomes for Top Rank and Team Crawford. In any event, I'd love to hear your thoughts on what he should be doing next. Love to hear your thoughts on everything I just discussed here, from Bradley, Algieri, all that sort of stuff. Want to hear your thoughts, your take. Be sure to leave it in the comments, and hit me up on Twitter at 12RounderBoxing. Be sure to visit 12rounder.com. And, of course, like, share, comment, subscribe, all that sort of stuff. This weekend we have a couple of interesting fights. Again, the Terence Crawford versus Ray Beltran fight. On the same card, we're going to have Evgeny Gradovich taking on Jason Velez in a battle of unbeaten in a battle of unbeaten featherweights. Then across the pond in London at the XL Arena, we're going to have the heavyweight clash between Tyson Fury and Derek Chisora, a rematch of their 2011 bout. We're going to have unbeaten middleweight rivals Billy Joe Saunders and Chris Eubank taking each other on. We're also going to see Liam Walsh versus Gary Sykes, and Frankie Gavin versus Bradley Skeet. A very interesting fight card, especially on paper, and it'll be interesting to hear your thoughts on that as well. So leave them in the comments, like, share, comment, all that sort of stuff. Subscribe, of course, and until next time, enjoy the fights.